The cold wind howled through the dark, empty streets, rattling the few remaining autumn leaves on the trees. A homeless man named Daniel sat on the damp sidewalk, his tattered coat wrapped tightly around him. The city had long stopped caring about people like him, forgotten souls who blended into the background of busy lives. He had grown used to it, used to the way people walked past without so much as a glance. But that night, something was different. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change forever. A distant scream shattered the silence. Daniel's head snapped up. It came from the alley across the street. At first, he thought he imagined it, just another trick his tired mind played on him. But then he heard it again, clearer this time. Filled with fear, without thinking, he pushed himself up and hurried toward the sound. His worn-out boots splashed through puddles as he reached the alley's entrance. There, under the flickering streetlight, a young woman struggled against two men. One had his hand clamped over her mouth, while the other yanked at her purse. Her wide, terrified eyes locked onto Daniel's for a brief second. She was dressed in expensive clothes, a stark contrast to the filth and grime of the alley. Whoever she was, she didn't belong here. Daniel didn't have a plan. He barely had the strength to stand most days. But something inside him refused to look away. He picked up an empty glass bottle from the ground and hurled it toward the men. It shattered against the brick wall behind them, startling them just long enough for the woman to break free. She stumbled toward Daniel, gasping for breath. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing her wrist and pulling her away from the alley. They ran through the streets, her heels clicking against the pavement, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't stop until they reached a safer, well-lit area. The woman bent over, hands on her knees, trying to catch her breath. When she finally looked up, Daniel could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice rough from the cold. She nodded, though her hands trembled. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come." Daniel shrugged. Just did what anyone should. But they both knew that wasn't true. Plenty of people had walked by that alley and ignored what was happening. He had been the only one who stopped. The woman straightened up, brushing her long hair out of her face. "I'm Sophia," she said. "What's your name?" "Daniel." She studied him, taking in his worn-out clothes, his tired eyes. For a moment, it looked like she wanted to say something else. But instead, she reached into her purse. "Here, take this," she said, pulling out a handful of cash. Daniel's pride almost made him refuse, but he hadn't eaten in 2 days. He hesitated, then slowly took the money. "Thank you." "No," she said, shaking her head. "Thank you." With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Daniel watched her go, not realizing that this simple encounter had set something much bigger in motion. The next morning, Daniel woke up to the sound of deep, rumbling engines. He sat up from his makeshift bed under the bridge, rubbing his eyes. Then he saw them. 3 sleek black cars parked side by side in front of the abandoned building where he usually stayed. Their tinted windows hid whoever was inside, but Daniel could feel the weight of their presence. A few other homeless people nearby had stopped what they were doing, watching in silence. A man in a black suit stepped out of the first car. He was tall, with sharp features and an air of authority. His eyes scanned the area until they landed on Daniel. He started walking straight toward him. Daniel's pulse quickened. He had seen men like this before. Powerful, dangerous. He had no idea what they wanted, but every instinct in his body told him this was no ordinary visit. As the man stopped a few feet away, Daniel swallowed hard. "Can I help you?" he asked, though he doubted he had anything they needed. The man studied him for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Daniel," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "Miss Sophia would like to see you." Daniel frowned. "Sophia?" The man gave a single nod. "Please, come with us." Daniel glanced at the cars again, then back at the man. 100 questions raced through his mind. But one thing was clear. This wasn't a request. It was an invitation he couldn't refuse, and for the first time in years, he felt that his life was about to take a turn he never expected. Daniel hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering between the man in the suit and the black cars behind him. His instincts screamed at him to be cautious. Life had taught him that nothing ever came for free, and when rich people showed up looking for someone like him, it usually didn't mean anything good. But then he thought about Sophia, the girl he had saved. She had been genuinely scared last night, and he had been the only one who helped her. Maybe this was her way of thanking him, or maybe it was something else entirely. With a slow nod, Daniel stood up. The man in the suit gestured toward the car, holding the door open. Daniel climbed in, sinking into the plush leather seats. It had been years since he had been inside a car, let alone one as expensive as this. The door shut with a quiet click, and almost immediately, the engine purred to life. The ride was smooth, eerily silent, except for the faint hum of the road beneath them. Daniel kept his hands in his lap, staring out the window as the city blurred past. He had no idea where they were going, but with each passing street, the buildings grew taller, the sidewalks cleaner, the people better dressed. They were heading into a world far different from the one he had been surviving in. After what felt like forever, the car finally pulled into the driveway of a massive estate. The iron gates opened without a sound, revealing a mansion that looked like it belonged in a movie. White stone walls, towering windows, and perfectly manicured gardens surrounded the properties. Even in his wildest dreams, Daniel had never imagined himself standing in a place like this. The car stopped, and the door opened again. The suited man gave him a nod, signaling for him to step out. Daniel swallowed hard and did as he was told. Before he could take another step, the front doors of the mansion swung open, and Sophia appeared. She looked different in the daylight, less like the terrified girl from the alley, and more like someone who belonged in a place like this. Her expensive clothes were neatly pressed, her hair perfectly styled, and yet, when she saw him, her expression softened into something almost grateful. "You actually came," she said, walking toward him. Daniel stuffed his hands into his pockets. "Didn't seem like I had much of a choice," he muttered, glancing at the black cars behind him. Sophia sighed, shaking her head. "I didn't mean for it to feel that way. I needed to see you." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Why?" She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Because you saved my life last night, and I never even got the chance to explain who I am or why that happened." Daniel stayed quiet, waiting. Sophia glanced at the suited man before turning back to Daniel. "Come inside. I'll explain everything." With no better option, Daniel followed her through the grand doors. The inside of the mansion was just as breathtaking as the outside. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, walls lined with paintings that probably cost more than everything he had ever owned combined. It felt surreal, stepping into a world that had always been so far out of reach. She led him into a study, where a roaring fireplace warmed the room. Daniel sat awkwardly in a chair, while Sophia paced in front of him, clearly trying to find the right words. "My family is powerful," she finally said. "My father is a billionaire. He owns companies all over the world, and because of that, he has enemies." Daniel frowned. "Enemies?" She nodded. "Last night wasn't random. Those men in the alley weren't just robbers. They were sent by someone who wanted to use me to get to my father." Daniel's jaw tightened. So you were targeted? Yes, she said, meeting his eyes. And if you hadn't shown up, I don't know what would have happened to me. The weight of her words settled over him. He had thought he was just stopping a mugging, doing the right thing, but now he realized he had stepped into something much bigger than himself. Sophia sat down across from him. My father wants to meet you. He wants to thank you personally. Daniel shifted in his seat. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. He wasn't looking for rewards or recognition. He had just done what felt right. But before he could say anything, the doors to the study opened and a tall man stepped inside. Daniel didn't need to ask who he was. The way Sophia straightened, the way the suited man outside had treated him, it was clear. This was her father. The man's gaze landed on Daniel, studying him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. He wasn't just looking at him. He was assessing him, trying to figure out what kind of person he was. You must be Daniel, the man finally said, his voice deep and authoritative. Daniel stood up, nodding. Yeah. The man walked closer, then extended a hand. I'm Richard Caldwell. My daughter told me what you did for her. Daniel hesitated, then shook his hand. It was a firm grip, the kind of handshake that came from years of power and confidence. I owe you a great debt, Richard continued. And I don't take debts lightly. Daniel shook his head. I didn't do it for anything in return. Richard's expression remained unreadable. That may be true, but I repay what I owe. Before Daniel could respond, Richard turned to Sophia. Give us a moment alone. Sophia hesitated, then nodded and left the room. Once they were alone, Richard took a seat behind the massive desk. I did some research on you, he said, his fingers tapping against the wooden surface. Daniel Carter, 36 years old, former construction worker, no family, no home. Daniel's stomach twisted. He didn't like being laid out like that. His entire existence summed up in a few short sentences. Richard leaned forward. Tell me something, Daniel. If you had the chance to change your life, would you take it? Daniel frowned. What are you talking about? Richard's gaze didn't waver. I have enemies, and last night proved that my daughter is a target. I need someone who isn't just capable, but someone I can trust. You stepped in when no one else did. That tells me a lot about the kind of man you are. Daniel stiffened. Are you offering me a job? In a way, Richard said. I'm offering you a new life, a way out of the streets. Daniel's mind raced. A new life. He had spent years scraping by, wondering if he would even survive another winter. And now, out of nowhere, he was being offered a future. But at what cost? He glanced at Richard, trying to gauge his intentions. There was power behind those eyes. But there was something else too, something deeper. Before Daniel could answer, the study doors burst open. Sophia ran in, her face pale with fear. Dad, she gasped. We have a problem. Daniel turned just as one of the suited men rushed inside, his expression grim. Sir, we've received a message. Richard's jaw clenched. From who? The man hesitated, then handed him a phone. The people who took out the hit on your daughter. Daniel's heart pounded. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Richard's face darkened as he took the phone, his fingers tightening around it. The room fell into heavy silence as he read the message. Daniel could see Sophia's hands trembling at her sides, her breath uneven. Whatever was on that screen, it wasn't good. Richard exhaled sharply, then handed the phone back to his security chief. What do they want? The man hesitated. They want you to pay, or they'll try again. Sophia's face paled. Dad! Richard stood up, straightening his suit. "I don't negotiate with threats." Daniel watched the exchange, his mind racing. He might not know the world of billionaires and power struggles, but he understood danger. These weren't just petty criminals looking for a quick payout. They were serious. And if they had already tried once, they wouldn't stop. "I need to leave," Sophia said suddenly, her voice shaking. "If they're after me, I can't just stay here waiting for them to try again." "No," Richard said firmly. "You're safer here, with security." Daniel could see the conflict in her eyes. She didn't want to feel like a prisoner in her own home, but she also knew her father was right. Outside, she was vulnerable. He stepped forward. "What if we turn the tables?" Richard looked at him, intrigued. "Go on." Daniel glanced at the security chief. "They think they're the hunters. What if we make them the hunted?" The man nodded slowly, considering it. "If we make them think Sophia is an easy target again, we might be able to track them back to whoever sent them." Sophia swallowed hard. "You mean, use me as bait?" Daniel hesitated before nodding. "Only if you're willing, and only if we do it right." Richard's expression was unreadable, but after a long moment, he gave a small nod. "If it means ending this for good, we do it." That night, a careful plan was put into motion. Sophia would be seen leaving the estate, heading to a public place with minimal security, just enough to make it look like she wasn't completely unprotected. Daniel would be with her, blending into the background, while Richard's men worked behind the scenes, tracking any movements. Daniel wasn't a trained bodyguard, but he knew how to stay aware, how to read a situation before it turned bad. He had spent years on the streets surviving, always looking over his shoulder. Now, those instincts were going to be put to the test. As they walked through the dimly lit streets, Sophia clutched her purse tightly, her eyes scanning the surroundings. She looked nervous, but she trusted Daniel. And Daniel, he was ready. Then, it happened. A black van turned the corner ahead of them, slowing down just enough to be suspicious. Daniel's grip on Sophia's wrist tightened. "Here we go." A van screeched to a stop, and two masked men jumped out. But this time, they weren't facing an unprepared girl. Before they could reach Sophia, Daniel stepped forward, blocking their path. The first man swung at him, but Daniel ducked, driving his elbow into the man's stomach. The second one lunged at Sophia, but before he could grab her, security agents swarmed from the shadows, taking him down within seconds. It was over before it even started. The masked men struggled, but they were outnumbered. Within minutes, they were restrained, and Richard's head of security stepped forward, pulling off one of their masks. Daniel didn't recognize the man, but Richard did. His face darkened. "I should have known." Sophia looked at her father. "Who is he?" Richard exhaled, shaking his head. "An old business rival, someone who's wanted to hurt me for a long time." He turned to the security chief. "Make sure the police take care of this, and make sure he knows this was his last mistake." The men were dragged away, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Sophia let out a long breath. It was over. She turned to Daniel, a small, grateful smile appearing on her face. "I don't know how to thank you." Daniel shrugged. "You already did, by trusting me." Richard stepped forward, looking at Daniel with something different in his eyes this time. Not just gratitude, but respect. "You saved my daughter twice. That's not something I forget." Daniel met his gaze. "I wasn't looking for anything in return." Richard nodded. "I know, but that's exactly why I'm offering you something anyway." Sophia tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Richard crossed his arms. "Daniel, you said before that if you had the chance to change your life, you weren't sure if you'd take it. Well, I'm giving you that chance now. Daniel frowned. "What are you saying?" "I want you to stay," Richard said. "Not just for now. Work for me. Not just as security, but as someone I can trust." Daniel hesitated. His whole life, he had learned to expect nothing, to survive, to get by. And now, someone was offering him stability, purpose. He looked at Sophia, then back at Richard. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right," he said. "I'm in." Sophia smiled. Richard extended his hand once more, and this time, when Daniel shook it, he knew his life would never be the same again.